Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather, and on today's episode, we're doing a Canadian crime that took place in Sydney River, Nova Scotia. And I read the book called Murder at McDonald's, The Killers Next Door. I'll link it below, and it was quite upsetting because of all the circumstances that took place. It's a really good book. If you like true crime reading, I definitely would check it out. Anyways, I was too young to actually remember when this all happened, but it said that it really shook up all of Canada, and it was just so unbelievable and so senseless. It's about a mass murder that took place inside a McDonald's restaurant, and there has been other McDonald's murders or murders that took place in fast food restaurants. But what makes this one different is that it was one of the first mass murders in fast food restaurants in Canada. And there are quite a few people here that we're going to talk about. I will try not to confuse you, but just get comfortable. Sydney River is a small bedroom community on the outskirts of Sydney, Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada. And just like most towns across North America, there was a McDonald's restaurant on one of the main roads in town, which can also be seen from the highway. And this McDonald's was like any other McDonald's where the community would just go, grab a quick meal, get a treat, bring their families. They knew friends that worked there. It was also situated in a bit of a shopping area where other restaurants lined the streets, like gas stations and other small businesses. Jimmy Fagan was an employee of McDonald's who was scheduled to work the night of May 7th, 1992. He was the son of Al and Teresa Fagan, who raised 5 boys and 2 girls, and Jimmy loved life, and he was known for his huge smile. He was also 27 years old and was actually gearing up to quit McDonald's to work for his brother's landscaping company. This time of year, the snow was melting, but it was still quite cold, so it would be only another week or so before Jimmy would give his notice. He liked working at McDonald's, and he mentioned that he'd miss his friends that he made, but he loved working outside more. Mcneal Burrows was another night shift worker and a friend of Jimmy's. And working the late shift, it was their job to get the restaurant ready for the breakfast crew. And they loved working together. They would joke all night, they would tell stories, and their long shift would just go by super fast because they got along so well. Mcneal was said to have a great sense of humor, and he was 29 years old and working to support his wife and child. Now, employment was scarce in 1992 in Nova Scotia and most of the East Coast, but between his job at McDonald's and his wife's hairdressing job, they were doing okay. And on this particular night, Mcneal was working 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and Jimmy was working the staggered shift 2 a.m. to 10 a.m., And even though Jimmy had a few hours before his shift started, he liked to come in a little bit early so he could chat and hang out with the evening crew before they went home. That night, the last of the evening crew would be Donna Warren and Arlene McNeil. Donna and Arlene were also good friends, and usually they liked to leave the restaurant together. Donna Warren was the shift manager at McDonald's, but had started working there while in high school. She was 22 years old and had enrolled in the radio and television program at Memorial High to gain communication skills she would need to be a defense attorney. Her mother was very proud of Donna, and Donna was said to be very ambitious and very, very kind. Arlene McNeil was 21 and was saving up to earn enough money to go to university. Arlene was already done her shift, but she wanted to wait for Donna as they typically like to leave the restaurant together. It made them feel safe at night to go to their cars together and follow each other on the way home. And this was before cell phones. So their parents also liked this because you never know if someone's car was going to break down or you'd have troubles. Arlene's last duty before she was done her shift was to stock the inventory, but it took her less time than usual because Derek Wood had stayed to help her out. Derek Wood was 18, and he was also new to McDonald's, being hired for only about a few months. And some would say he was a bit awkward and maybe shy. He had grown on the other side of the tracks, so to speak, and he still seemed to have that teenage angst, but like other teenagers, he was also interested in computers, video games, and music. He hadn't had any plans as far as his future went because he had dropped out of high school. But getting a job at McDonald's would keep him busy, and he hoped that one day he could move out of the house. His main job was to work the cash register, and on this night, he didn't seem to be in any hurry to leave. So he offered to help out Arlene stocking the inventory, and Arlene was happy to have the help. So because Arlene had a bit of time before Donna's shift was over, she would go into the basement office to count those colorful plastic sticks that are used to hold Ronald McDonald's balloons. There was a birthday party scheduled the following day, so she thought she would help get that organized. So inside the restaurant, we would have Donna, Arlene, Neil, and Jimmy was on his way. Jimmy had decided to jump in a cab last minute because it was really cold on this particular night and the winds were getting icy. Donna would make her way downstairs to check on Arlene before they would leave together. What they didn't know was that Derek still hadn't gone home after his shift. He was down the road at a payphone calling his friends Darren Muse and Freeman Mcneil. Darren Muse was also 18, and he had also dropped out of high school, but he wasn't really a bad kid as far as we know. In fact, he was athletic, well-liked, and had really supportive parents. He was the youngest of 4 boys, and I guess his only downfall was that he was always trying to prove himself to people, and that probably comes with low self-esteem. His parents loved him very much, and his dad hoped that if school wasn't really his thing, that at least he'd go into business with him. It's said that Darren also planned to work with computers as he saw them as the way of the future. Freeman Mcneil was 23 and had already finished high school. He had spent a year at the Nova Scotia Teachers College, and he worked briefly at Malcolm Monroe Junior High as a student teacher. The faculty had all really liked him, but he lost his ambition to be a teacher and left his job to work as a private security guard. Work wasn't really steady though, so this meant he was spending more and more time with Derek and Darren. And it said that Freeman seemed a little lost in life and couldn't really figure out what he wanted to do with himself. Shortly after Derek Wood was hired at McDonald's, he came up with the idea to rob it. I guess there's a big conveyor belt for deliveries, and it had broken down one day while Derek was working. So he was sent to the basement to a different door near the true craning room. This door wasn't used as often as the other entrances, and it's this door that made Derek Wood realize that anyone could just come in unnoticed. That is, if it was left propped open, and anyone could just rob the place. Derek Wood, Darren, and Freeman thought that if they had money, then maybe they'd be able to do something more with their lives. So when Wood approached them with this idea, it seemed like a good idea. What could possibly go wrong? Now, for some reason, they thought the restaurant would have upwards of $200,000 in the safe. And this is what really solidified their plan. All they needed to do was break in and steal it. Derek would leave the basement door open, which was rarely used, and they'd slip in unnoticed. Freeman would man the door, making sure nobody could escape, and Darren would watch the kitchen while Wood would grab the cash. And originally, their plan wasn't to harm anyone, but as they formulated their plan, it got increasingly disturbing. So they talked about using their martial arts skills on the employees. Then Freeman decided to steal a gun from his girlfriend's dad, a .22 caliber pistol, for intimidation. And Darren also decided to wear a Halloween mask and subdue anyone working in the kitchen. They also thought they might need a 4th person to man the door in case anyone tried to escape. Gregory Lawrence was asked to be this person. They went over all the details with him, and at first he agreed because the sound of splitting $200,000 piqued his interest. But Gregory backed out last minute. He just had a bad feeling and didn't want to be a part of their plan. But Derek, Darren, and Freeman decided to go ahead with their plan anyways. On May 6th, Freeman drove Derek to work, and Derek took the gun, the ammunition, and stuffed it into his backpack, and he went into the building. He would then change into his uniform and stuff his clothes into his backpack where the gun and ammunition hid. When Derek's shift was almost over, Darren and Freeman would put on a second pair of clothes over their street clothes. And the second pair of clothes were to be discarded later in case any fibers were left on the scene. They parked at the Tim Hortons down the road where they could see the McDonald's up the hill where they'd wait. When Derek was done, he changed out of his uniform and jammed the backpack against the frame of the basement door, making sure it was left slightly ajar. Then he headed to Tim Hortons and joined Darren and Freeman. From Tim Hortons, they would drive to the other side of the bypass, over the highway into a residential area, and parked in a secluded gravel road. They would walk across a field, then run back over the freeway into another field that bordered McDonald's. They would quietly approach the basement door and sneak in. At this time, Arlene and Donna were just finishing up in the basement office where Arlene was sorting the party favors. So they would walk almost into the hallway where they would see Derek Wood armed with a pistol. Darren had his mask on and he held 2 knives, and Freeman was holding a shovel. The 3 men startled Donna and Arlene, and the girls just stopped suddenly. Donna had always joked that if she was ever robbed, she would just carry the safe out for the robbers. She would comply and do anything to avoid trouble. Tonight, though, she was confused because she recognized Derek Wood. So he looked at her, she looked at him. Arlene, too, would recognize Derek and thought it was strange that he brought in friends to the restaurant. That wasn't allowed, and why the Halloween mask? Arlene would ask, "Is this a joke?" and then Wood raised his arms and shot her. Arlene fell to the ground, still holding the colorful sticks she was counting for the birthday party. Donna would panic and she would crouch down to help her friend. Now, Derek and Darren would then run past everyone and straight upstairs, while Mcneal was still working away scrubbing the sinks. So it's assumed that Mcneal didn't hear the shot because of the noise from the machines in the restaurant. So he would be on one knee holding the sink when suddenly he fell to the floor. Mcneal would still be alive, but he would then see blood pooling on the floor in front of him and probably in his mouth. Darren would then take one of the knives and plunge it into the left side of Mcneal's neck, attempting to reach his jugular. And it said in one of their confessions that this also did not kill Mcneal, and he would try and get up again, asking for help. Darren would yell out, "This guy just won't die," and Freeman would suddenly show up and swing violently towards Mcneal with his shovel. But it would take one more shot of the gun before Mcneal succumbed to his injuries. Donna was still in the basement and she was scared for her life, and Derek Wood would return to the office downstairs. He would tell her to go back upstairs and demanded that she open the safe, and she actually managed to remember the combination even though it said she was hysterical. After the door of the safe opened, she stood up but quickly collapsed after Wood shot her in the head. Derek would take the money from the safe and shoot Donna one more time in the face. And Wood didn't know it at the time, but the safe only had $2,017. Unfortunately, when this was all happening, Jimmy was entering the parking lot in the cab he hired to take him to work. When Derek and his friends were about to leave the restaurant, Jimmy would open the door and he would see his coworker, Derek Wood. And Jimmy would then just say hi to Derek. And it's unclear at this point who actually pulled the trigger, but most reports say that Freeman would shoot Jimmy. Jimmy would fall down right there in the doorway. The 3 men jumped over him and then back out across the field. Now, the cab driver that dropped Jimmy off heard what he thought was firecrackers, and he looked back towards McDonald's to see the 3 figures running out of the restaurant carrying bags. He would then throw the cab into reverse, screeching the tires to see if he could get someone's attention inside. And nobody came out, so he drove back up towards the drive-thru to see Jimmy slumped in the doorway. Daniel, the cab driver, would radio for RCMP and ambulance to come to McDonald's, and he also wouldn't leave the scene, but he would drive around the restaurant just praying for help to arrive soon. The 3 men ran back to their car, but Freeman would throw his bloody shovel into a culvert not far from where the car was parked. Back in the car, Darren would brag that he, quote, finally got to slit someone's throat, end quote. It was said that Darren actually told his friends month earlier that he wasn't really into violence, so even to Derek and Darren, this comment seemed very strange. Derek Wood would also realize that he left his backpack still shoved in the door of the basement. He needed to create a new alibi for himself, so he demanded that they pull the car over and he would run to a nearby convenience store to report that he heard gunshots from inside the restaurant while he was outside smoking after his shift. He inadvertently just left his bag there as he ran away to call police. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, cab driver Daniel was probably in shock circling the parking lot waiting for help. His friend and fellow cab driver John McInnes rushed over to help. and they would both get out of their cars and ran to the doorway where Jimmy was laying face down. They would roll him over and see that he was still alive, but desperately needed help. John would radio for help again, saying that his fare was shot in the head, and Daniel would rush back to get paper towels to try and stop the bleeding. Now, this is not the emergency responders' first call for help. Someone else, someone anonymous, had also called who sounded very panicked. This was Derek. As Daniel McInnes was holding the paper towel to Jimmy's forehead, he would hear the phone ringing inside the restaurant. He knew that there was always someone working, so it was weird to him that nobody was answering. So he decided to go inside to see who was calling. As he walked through the office where the phone was ringing, he would see Donna slumped over in a very awkward position. He answered the phone, but nobody was on the other end. And seeing this female with her head bent in such an awkward position, he'd pull her away from the wall. And realizing the extent of what was happening, he knew he needed to get back outside. On his way out, he would see Neil laying face down in a pool of blood that extended over a meter around his head. And Neil was still clutching the leg of the sink. He would check for a pulse, and sadly, there was none. Daniel needed to tell John what he saw, but on his way out, he would hear gurgling sounds and panicked. He thought someone was still inside, perhaps a shooter. The gurgling he heard was unfortunately Arlene, who was laying face down, gasping for breath. She was inhaling blood from a large puddle that formed around her head from being shot. When police arrived, Daniel would tell them what he saw. Loud bangs that sounded like firecrackers, and then 2, possibly 3 individuals who ran into the nearby field. John would then come running out screaming, "There are bodies everywhere." Now, remember, this is a small town, so calling for backup meant that officers from surrounding towns needed to come in, and that sometimes can take upwards of an hour. So Corporal Clearly, the police officer who arrived on the scene first, had to make the call whether or not to go inside. Constable Henry Jensen offered to go in with him, so they would sweep the restaurant together, not knowing who or what they would find, all without backup. Police later said what they encountered in the restaurant would change their lives forever. The crime scene was so fresh that the smell of gunpowder and blood still lingered in the air. Several young victims whose lives were savagely taken. Donna was shot so close that her eye was black from the gunpowder stippling and soot. Her hair was bloody and matted, and there was bloodstains on the wall, and the sounds of Arlene clinging on to life would haunt them forever. To these officers, it seemed unimaginable that this crime scene could simply be about money. And thankfully, the ambulance arrived quickly, and Arlene and Jimmy were taken to hospital, but with life-threatening injuries. Sadly, Donna and Neil were beyond help. Derek Wood had called police a second time from King's convenience store, but this time he gave his name and said that he was there when the shooting took place. Because police were so busy, they took Derek's information down and told him to go home, and they called him in the morning. Freeman and Darren drove back to Freeman's house, and his mother would wake up and ask where they were. Freeman would tell her that he was actually at his girlfriend's house, but he had come home to get her inhaler. Then, to make himself more credible, he'd call his girlfriend and tell her that he'd found it. Darren and Freeman would then leave again, and Freeman told his mother that he was going to stay at his girlfriend's house that night. Instead, they'd be disposing of their clothes, spent shell casings, and anything that wasn't of value taken from the safe. After that, Freeman would drop Darren off at a 24-hour convenience store before heading off to his girlfriend's house. Darren would kill some time there playing the poker machines before heading home. So, in less than 2 hours after slitting a man's throat, Darren was using the money he stole to play some video poker. Derek would wander around the streets. The businesses around King Street were all on lockdown as per police instruction because they weren't really sure where the killers were, and they didn't want to take any chances. Derek Wood saw the roadblock around the McDonald's and eventually made his way down there to speak with police, just to further lock down his alibi. And it's assumed Wood was probably in shock and overly excited from adrenaline, because when he spoke with police, he would go from calm to excited to relaxed again. His behavior was so odd that police almost thought that he was drunk. Derek also wasn't making sense. His story about where he went and what he did after witnessing the shooting changed as well. So Derek was taken to the station for questioning. Police also found his footsteps going into the restaurant through the back door. And if he had gone outside for a smoke, heard gunshots, and ran, why were his footsteps going back inside? The community of Sydney was so upset. This type of violent robbery was so unusual, and other businesses started to become fearful. What if the killers wanted to do this again? Not long after, sadly, Jimmy's family would hear that Jimmy was basically gone. He was living solely on life support, so they would have to say goodbye to the person who loved life and loved people. Arlene would also be on life support, but for her, there was hope. They didn't know what to expect at the time, but Arlene would survive. But she would be heavily affected by being shot, and she would remain in a wheelchair and disabled for the rest of her life. Derek would eventually lead police to Darren Muse and Freeman Mcneil, doing his best not to incriminate himself. The frustrating thing was they all wore gloves, so there was no fingerprints left behind. And a lot of the evidence still hadn't been found either, so police really had nothing to go on. So they were really pushing for a confession. When Derek was brought in, he was at first very cooperative and agreed to a polygraph, but then he changed his mind and refused. He eventually agreed to do it the following day instead. So police would take Darren home and agree to pick him up the next morning for his test. Later that same night, Darren would write a suicide note and slit his wrist. However, his injury was superficial and didn't even require medical attention at all. And his note was also very strange. It mentioned people who were in Halifax and that Darren thought he might be in danger. Darren was brought back in for the polygraph and he failed the test, but he still wouldn't admit to anything. He was being very arrogant and eventually he would just ask to go home. And police couldn't hold him, so they drove him back, and while they were driving, he made up another false story about hearing strangers talking about robbing McDonald's. He thought he was being followed by them, and then he told the officer of his failed suicide attempt. It was quite obvious that this lame attempt at suicide and confusing suicide note was made up to throw off police. Finally, on May 15th, Gregory Lawrence gave a statement to police. Now remember, Gregory Lawrence was asked to be the fourth person involved in the robbery, but he backed out the last minute. His statement was implicating Darren, Freeman, and Derek. The police found his statement to be very credible because he knew of the Halloween mask and the .22 caliber revolver, that it was stolen by Freeman from his girlfriend's stepdad and was going to be brought to the robbery. The robbery was supposed to be May 1st, but was delayed until Derek was scheduled to work a night shift. And Gregor didn't initially come to police because all three of them denied that it was them. They all said it was a strange coincidence that the robbery took place at the very same McDonald's they planned to rob. And it wasn't until Gregory noticed that Derek stopped hanging out with the others. He seemed distant, like something was bothering him. Freeman was also all of a sudden buying car stereo equipment when normally he didn't have any money at all. It was their behavior that made Gregor realize that it was probably them and he should go to police. Police would detain all three of them again for questioning. On Derek Wood's 19th birthday, while he was out celebrating and drinking with his friends, he was arrested and brought in. Derek would sit in silence, reminding the police of his right to remain silent. And when Derek finally did break, he would pick up a piece of paper that listed his charges and pointed to them one by one saying, guilty, guilty, not guilty, guilty. And then he said he was scared, but he would give them his own statement. Apparently, Derek never got a cut of the money. He didn't want it. So he detached himself from the other two men and just tried to move on with his life and block out the robbery, which just seemed to be too much for him. Freeman was next in a partial confession, and Derek would be the last to confess. When Freeman was questioned, he finally started to crack, but his statement was so completely inconsistent. He basically just threw his friends under the bus. Freeman took police on a reenactment to show them what had happened and claimed he only picked up Darren after the robbery. And he would also say that Darren said Derek did all the shooting, but he feels it was probably more Darren that did it. He would also show them the brook where all the evidence was dumped. When Darren confessed, he would deny that he even wanted to harm anyone. He said that the deaths were not his fault. His mind apparently went blank after hearing the first shot. Then he exercised his right to remain silent. Police didn't give up though. They would continue to ask him questions, and after Darren spoke with a lawyer, he gave a new, more detailed confession, saying that after Derek shot the manager, he heard another shot upstairs. So he went to go see what happened. He would see a man bleeding on the floor by the sink, and he knew this man needed help. Darren felt that this man was going to die anyways, and he didn't want the man to suffer anymore, so that's why he stabbed him. He wanted everyone to know that he wasn't a shooter and only hurt someone to put them out of their misery. There were 3 separate trials for the boys, and they all stuck to their own stories, putting more involvement on the others. Derek Wood received 2 life sentences, one for the first-degree murder of Donna Warren and Neil Burrows, and a second sentence for the attempted murder of Arlene McNeil. His sentence was a plea bargain though, so he was to give a confession for the exchange of 2 10-year terms for unlawful confinement and armed robbery, which to me is bullshit. So he's been eligible for parole, but he's been denied because apparently he's a shithead in jail too. Darren Muse was sentenced to 20 years before being eligible for parole. He was granted full parole on November 22, 2012, with the imposed restrictions of not allowing contact with surviving victims or family, refrain from going back to Sydney, Nova Scotia, and no drugs. Freeman Mcneil was sentenced to first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and forcible confinement. He was believed to provide the gun, which he denies, the escape vehicle, rope, and a shovel. He denies that he even knew someone had a gun. He has since been granted temporary unescorted absences from prison once a month as of November 2019, as a lead-up to day parole eligibility. Arlene has since passed away from complications of her injuries in 2008, and it's said that she was still very happy and loved playing on the computer and listening to country music. The media often reports this as a botched robbery, and I don't really know why. Saying it was botched makes it sound less gruesome, more like an accident. But these guys were planning on robbing the place for weeks. They planned all the details, and Derek knew that his coworkers were going to be inside. The same coworkers that he had worked with just hours before. Nobody tried to confront him or try to stop him. They didn't attack him, and they didn't do anything but say hi. There was no doubt that Donna would have just handed over the money without question. And obviously they didn't want witnesses, but they knew they were going to be witnesses. They knew they were going to be there. The men also didn't plan to leave town, and knowing there would be witnesses, the plan should have been for them to get out of Dodge, not sleep over at their girlfriend's house or play video poker at the convenience store. I'm sure their plan was to have no witnesses, destroy evidence, and deny everything. The McDonald's on Kings Road would operate for another 8 more years before the owner decided to close its doors and tear it down. They rebuilt it in another area of town, and the empty lot still remains vacant to this day. And none of the men ever explained their actions for the crimes they committed that night. All they wanted was money, and all they got was a measly $2,017. And it makes me pretty mad to think that the victims were all so nice to Derek. They were his co-workers. There was no issue between him and Jimmy, Arlene, Donna, and Neil. And I remember how I was in my early 20s, going to work, having friends there. It was good times. I have great memories. It's an age where you're growing up and becoming independent, and you're just not thinking about being murdered. You would never imagine that a coworker at a place like McDonald's would be your nightmare. It was so incredibly senseless, and it didn't need to happen. I also feel terrible for everyone in Sydney River. Stuff like this just hits harder in a small town. Everybody knows everybody. You know your neighbors. This crime has left a permanent mark on Sydney, and I'm not sure justice was ever served here. This case is so brutal and so cold. My heart goes out to everyone who was infected that night. Thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator. Please hit subscribe so you don't miss another episode, and hit like if you want to show me some support.